So when I started making videos about games, I had three main reasons in mind. Shadowrun was purely to bring a spotlight to a series that I think deserves more attention than it received. With the Monkey Island Special Editions, I wanted to see how a historic game would hold up in the modern era. This video revolves around my last reason. The reason games are so diverse despite being a relatively new medium. The reason that, to some people, sitting idly by and collecting cookies is just as viable a subject as ripping the eyeballs out of demons on Mars. And that reason is mechanics. This series is dedicated to covering games that have an interesting mechanic that drives them. So, this isn't so much a review as it is a breakdown of what designers and players can take away from playing this game. I can't guarantee that every game in this series will be a good game, but there's something about them that makes them stand out. Mechanicus is a Warhammer 40,000 game that follows the struggles of a battalion of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a group of fanatical tech priests who... You know what, I'll just let them introduce themselves.
From the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me. I craved the strength and certainty of steel. I aspired to the purity of the blessed machine. Your kind cling to your flesh, as if it will not decay and fail you. One day the crude biomass that you call the temple will wither, and you will beg my kind to save you. But I am already saved. For the machine is immortal.
You play as the commander of these beautiful transhumanist weirdos as they fight against a technologically advanced undead race called Necrons on the planet Silva Tenebris. It's every bit as edgy and grimdark and ridiculous as you could possibly want from a Warhammer 40,000 game. But we're not here to see how many articles from TV tropes we can check off on this game, because honestly we'd be here all day. Seriously, if you don't know anything about the Warhammer 40,000 lore, me just mentioning its existence is either a blessing or a curse to you. I will let you fall down that rabbit hole all on your own. So, instead, let's talk gameplay and what makes this tabletop wargame-inspired tactics game different. At first glance, Mechanicus is a standard tactics game. It probably looks a lot like those Shadowrun fights I showed you in the last video. But there's something interesting going on here. While most tactics games revolve around optimizing your character to hit enemies, making use of a set number of actions for each squad member, and being generally cautious, Mechanicus subtly tweaks traditional mechanics to encourage you to be aggressive and take the fight to the Xenos. If you've played a tactics game, you're probably familiar with some concept of action points. The exact name and function of action points varies from game to game, but in general, I'd say your standard action point system has these three qualities. First, each unit starts with a given number of action points at the beginning of their turn. Second, every action a unit performs has an associated action point cost. Third, a unit regains all of their action points at the beginning of their next turn. You can see all these qualities in Shadowrun's combat system. Games may put more restrictions on these points, such as Dungeons & Dragons breaking them down into standard move and bonus actions that can only be used for certain types of actions, but in general, they still maintain these basic tenets. In Mechanicus, all of your actions are instead fueled by cognition points. At first glance, these cognition points may seem to be a thematic reskin of action points. After all, you use them to activate items and abilities, fire more powerful weapons, and move more than your default movement speed. But there are a few tweaks to the formula that drastically change up the traditional action point economy. First of all, your points are communal for your entire team. If you were so inclined, you could expend every point of cognition you have on a single unit's turn, and leave no points for the rest of your units. This means that you have to think of your entire team as one entity and account for the relative strengths and weaknesses of each unit for a given situation. Do you go for broke with your Explorator unit and use multiple cognition points to reach a distant objective? Or should you save some points so that you can fire your massive energy cannon with your Dominus? Or maybe you do send that Explorator forward, but to harvest cognition points for the rest of your team to use. Or maybe you delay his turn until after all your other units have had their turns to extract cognition points from all of the downed enemies before finishing them off. There's a lot of possibilities here. With a traditional system that gives each unit their own action pool, you don't need to make these decisions. You're probably noticing another big change right about now. You can earn additional action points during your turn. Unlike most action point games, you don't passively regain cognition points. You need to acquire them. The most basic way to collect cognition points is to stand next to one of these Necron constructs that restock at the beginning of each combat initiative phase. Standing next to one will harvest all of the cognition points from it, and the constructs can range from containing 1 to 3 points. If you can't reach one, you could send your trusty Servo Skull to collect a point, but that means it will be on cooldown for several turns, and they serve multiple purposes. We'll cover why you may not want to do this a little bit later. Perhaps my favorite way to get cognition was to send out a cannon fodder minion. In addition to your tech priests, you can bring reinforcements in from the Skitarii. The first unit you are given is called a Servitor, and while they aren't worth much in a fight, they gain you a point of cognition for every hit they take, and that's an energy blast that wasn't directed at a tech priest. It's pretty interesting seeing a tactics game explicitly encourage you to get a unit damaged. Finally, you could always gain some cognition from a downed enemy. That's right, if you stand next to a disabled enemy or finish one off from a range, you can gain a point of cognition from them to fuel even more attacks. If you pair this with a couple of items that let you poke an adjacent enemy to harvest cognition from them, you can gain 3 cognition just from walking up to a downed enemy. This incentivizes you to get up close and personal, so that you can use your enemy's death at the hands of one of your tech priests to fuel the assault of the next one. The only real limit to this system is that all of your weapons have a cooldown of 1 turn. So while a killing spree can net you a lot of cognition, you will still need to let them have a turn in order to keep on firing. I imagine this is necessary to keep you from going on an absolute rampage and chaining together enough kills to wipe out all of the enemies before they get a chance to act. That being said, you'll want to make sure you put as much ordnance downrange as you can due to another mechanic that encourages you to engage the enemy whenever possible. Fittingly for a bunch of tech priests, they believe that inside of each weapon there resides a machine spirit. The spirit gains energy every time you use your weapon until eventually granting a one-time bonus after it is fully charged. Ranged weapons tend to take 2 attacks to charge, while melee weapons take only 1. Since you can use every single weapon a tech priest holds once per turn, as long as you have the cognition points to do so, you're encouraged to fire every weapon every turn to quickly charge your weapon spirits. By making melee weapons charge faster and have a lower cognition cost, you're further encouraged to rush up to enemies to finish them off after a volley of shots. The last major twist I want to talk about is the imperfect information the game gives you. This isn't unique to Mechanicus, but the exact information that's obscured is interesting. When you begin a level, you'll see all of the present enemies, but you won't be able to see their health or armor levels. Armor is a huge part of this game, offering a flat reduction to all damage from its corresponding type, either physical or energy. This scales pretty consistently throughout the game, so it's not uncommon to see 7 or 8 armored enemies at later levels. Some bosses have 15 or more armor of a given type. This means that one of your types of damage may be rendered basically useless. To make matters worse, unless you gain intel on an enemy unit, you won't even know if you're doing damage to them. The damage will just appear as a question mark when you hit them. So, in order to even know how effective your attacks will be or have been, you'll need to scan them. Usually, this will mean sending one of your priest's servo skulls over to the enemy to scan them. Like everything else though, servo skulls have a cooldown, and your priests are usually outnumbered, so you probably won't be able to scan every enemy right away. Servo skulls also have other uses. So, you need to weigh the benefit of knowing your enemy's statistics against a benefit like extra armor for a tech priest, extra movement and damage for a troop, or collecting 3 cognition points from a distant relic. So, by tying all of these options to this ability, the developers have created an information economy to go alongside the cognition point economy. All of these systems are excellent examples of how tiny tweaks can bring an entirely new feel to a familiar genre. You don't need to develop a completely novel system for it to feel fresh. Now, that's not to say that these systems are flawless. For the most part, I think they fall victim to the same problem that a lot of systems do in progression-based tactics games. And that's the fact that powerful abilities and items tend to render early mechanics useless. As you progress, not only does your cognition pool increase, but getting cognition points becomes easier and easier as well. As I mentioned earlier, you can gain an item that gives you 2 cognition points from any adjacent enemy. You can pop one of these on every tech priest in your roster, and it's almost certainly worth the equipment points to do so. One late game ability simply fills up your entire cognition pool, and only has a 3-turn cooldown. You can unlock items that reveal multiple enemies' stats in an area, which all but eliminates the Servo Skull economy at later levels. Every tech priest that's going to get into melee will probably invest in a skill at the bottom of one of the skill trees that allows them to freely scan every enemy they move adjacent to. This is an interesting problem to tackle in any game that features character progression. Obviously, you want the characters to become more powerful, and since these mechanics are also present in the early game, they can't be balanced around late game upgrades. I think that a way that you could do this was to decrease the recharge rate of the cognition relics as you got further into the campaign. Perhaps as the awakening meter to the tomb increased throughout the campaign, you would make the relics take an additional turn to recharge, making attacking enemies for cognition points more important as they and your tech priests become more powerful. Canticles are another mechanic that I think undermine these strong systems. Canticles are powerful spells that you can collect and have huge effects such as easily gaining enough cognition points to fill your pool, ignoring all armor for the next few attacks. This could be toned down by either making Canticles expendable items that are lost permanently after they are used, or perhaps by simply limiting their use to the same phase that you deploy Skitarii units instead of during any tech priest's turn. Luckily for us, the developers have provided a really wonderful tool to increase the difficulty of your playthrough. In addition to the usual preset difficulty modes, there's also a fairly robust set of custom difficulty options. Think money wasn't tight enough on this playthrough? You can adjust the amount you receive. Or perhaps you kitted out all your tech priests with the best gear and thought it got a bit stale. Just check a box and now each piece of gear will be limited to use on a single tech priest. Maybe you like a good fight but hate timers. Beef up enemy HP and reduce the amount of awakening you get each turn or room explored. I really cannot praise developers enough when they provide players with tools to create their own challenges. Being able to emphasize the parts of the game that you like or apply modifiers that fundamentally change how you play are massive incentives towards replayability and can also serve as accessibility tools for players who either don't want to or can't experience the game in its default state. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on some of the more interesting quirks of this game. Overall, it could certainly use some polish, and it's by no means perfect, but if you're looking for a short budget tactics game, or you enjoy the Warhammer 40k setting, then the game's probably worth a shot. I say budget because the game will normally run you about $30 on Steam or GOG, but as usual, if you wait for a sale, you could be able to pick it up for under $10. I personally obtained my copy from Humble Bundle, and it will probably be a staple in any future 40k bundles you see there. Let me know what you think about this type of content. I'm a big fan of unique game mechanics, and like seeing what we can learn from more obscure titles like this. If you want to see more of this stuff, or have a suggestion, go ahead and let me know in the comments. If you really want to see more stuff like this, or my other reviews, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that I can see you next month. Halloween's right around the corner, so get ready for some spooks from probably the strangest adventure game I've ever played.